Arthur Dayne had always moved like quicksilver across any field of battle. Even as a squire, he had possessed an almost supernatural grace that made onlookers believe he was touched by the seven. When he was knighted and became a Kingsguard, that grace manifested itself fully in every motion he made, every time dawn glimmered in his hand. Men said Arthur Dayne was born to hold the sword that had once been forged from the heart of a fallen star. Some whispered the blade itself was alive in his grasp, singing with each swing. And though his life was said to have ended on a forlorn morning by the Tower of Joy, there are many corners of Westeros where men still tell tales of the Sword of the Morning. Tales where the greatest sword to ever walk the land might yet return, renewed, to face a threat older than any mortal memory. In these tales, Arthur Dayne did not die in that lonely skirmish. There are as many versions of how he survived as there are tongues that speak them. Some claim Howland Reed used sorcery to spare his life, tricking Eddard Stark into believing Dayne dead. Others argue that Eddard found him mortally wounded and showed him mercy, helping him vanish into the anonymity of the far south. And there is even one bold rumor that Arthur Dayne was carried off by a mysterious woman with pale eyes who bound his wounds and spirited him away into the deserts of Dorne. Whatever the truth, the legends converge on one singular point. Arthur Dayne lived, unknown to the world, until the long night began to stir in the far north, and dreams of undead armies crept across the land like a shroud. He hid his name first, for the name Arthur Dayne would have been recognized in many places still loyal to the memory of Prince Rhaegar. He spent years in remote corners of Westeros, from the windswept wastes of Dorne to the dense forests of the Stormlands. Each time he moved to a new place, he felt Dawn's subtle call, though that famed sword was lost, buried in the stories of a day long gone. Night after night, Arthur dreamt of White Walkers and an ancient evil, and the dreams forced him to accept that his destiny would not be so easily denied. He saw glimpses of a white shadow moving across an endless field of ice. He heard the hush of unnatural winds and the bone-chilling screams that accompanied an onslaught of the dead. And in those visions, a voice echoed in his mind, a whisper that said only one weapon, one blade, could stand against the unstoppable tide. Dawn, reforged, renewed. In a hidden cove near the broken arm of Dorne, he made a life as a fisherman by day and a silent wanderer by dusk. The sea was kind enough to yield meager catches that allowed him to survive. He avoided other fishermen and spoke rarely, for fear of being recognized. He was older now, silver thread in the dark hair at his temples, but his posture remained almost regal. Beneath a simple woolen tunic, his body was still honed as if to quell any challenge that might appear. One bleak evening, a storm raged outside his modest shack. Lightning ignited the sky, thunder rolled across the sea, and the wind howled, rattling the wooden windows. The swirling black clouds brought a memory unbidden. The swirling of cloaks, the clang of steel in an old battle. But in this memory it was not men he fought. It was the silent ranks of whites, their dead eyes reflecting starlight, their rotted hands clawing at living flesh. Arthur woke from the memory in a cold sweat, heart pounding. He did not sleep at all that night. Instead, he kept to his small hearth, throwing driftwood onto a feeble fire and staring into the flames as if they might show him some clue. Something within him, perhaps that intangible tie he still held to the powers that guided Dawn, seemed to speak. It told him that time was running short. The storms he had seen in visions were not merely those of weather but of destiny. He saw, in the flickers of flame, a pattern of ice creeping across the land, and he knew with certainty that he could not remain in hiding, even if it meant renouncing the vow he once made to protect the Targaryen heirs. There was a new vow forming in his heart, a vow to protect the realm from the greatest danger it had ever faced. All across Westeros, the signs of gathering darkness multiplied. In the north, rumors came that the White Walkers were no longer mere phantoms from old Nan's tales. They had awoken. The dead were rising. Laughter in feasting halls grew brittle as lords and ladies realized the old stories might be real. Tensions among the living, between houses, between kings, between claimants, never truly eased, but a deeper horror seeped through the land. an unease that all men could feel in their bones. It was as if the dead had become restless with the living's petty squabbles, reminding them that there was a mightier enemy at their doorstep. Arthur had heard these rumors through travelers, fishermen who docked nearby, and the occasional merchant carrying trinkets from Dorne to the Stormlands. The talk of the dead rising made many laugh nervously, but Arthur recognized the same fear that had haunted his dreams. With each retelling, the fear grew. He began preparing. He sold his fishing boat to a local trader, a transaction that aroused little suspicion, for he was known as a man grown weary of storms and the precarious life at sea. Arthur kept only his personal effects, his horse and what little silver he had, then set out at dawn, when the sky was still tinted by the promise of sunlight and the horizon glowed faintly red. That color reminded him of the first time he had drawn dawn in earnest. The color reminded him that the blade was part of him still, wherever it might lie. Many believed that after Arthur died, dawn had been returned to Starfall. Rumor said it was locked away, waiting for a new Dayne to rise worthy enough to bear it. But rumor also said the castle had changed hands in these uncertain times, with lords and knights alike turning to old allegiances for safety. If the sword were indeed still in Starfall's possession, Arthur could not simply walk to its gates unannounced. If he were discovered by any who recognized him, the political ramifications could be dire. There were still some who labeled him a traitor to the crown that existed now, and others who called him a hero to a dead prince. Neither vantage would allow him to walk freely, but something in him insisted he had to go to Starfall first. If dawn was indeed hidden there, he would need it. No other blade would do. The trip across the blazing Dornish sands was long and punishing, and the horse was not young. Arthur proceeded steadily, rationing his water, careful not to draw undue notice. He changed out of his fisherman's garb in a roadside inn, donning the attire of a traveling hedge knight, simple leathers, a battered cloak. Along the route, he encountered caravans and traders, silent lines of camels and mules passing under the relentless sun. He kept his face shadowed by a hood, listening more than he spoke. In hushed corners of inns and taverns, the talk of the dead intensifying in the north was pervasive. Some speculated that the king in the north had faced them already. Others whispered that dragons were involved, that a dragon queen had come from across the sea, forging alliances to stand against the dark. Arthur kept his opinions to himself, but the mention of dragons struck a chord. He remembered Rhaegar Targaryen's intensity, the fierce, almost sorrowful brilliance that filled the prince's eyes whenever prophecy or the prince that was promised was mentioned. Arthur recalled nights spent with the prince, discussing legends, Azor Ahai, Lightbringer, the last hero. Rhaegar had been convinced that the coming war would be unlike any other, and that a hero must rise with a blade of living flame to meet the threat. But Rhaegar believed that hero to be his own son, a child Arthur had guarded. So many hopes, so many illusions scattered like ashes. Yet something about those old prophecies still nagged at Arthur. Perhaps they had pointed to the threat they now faced. Perhaps the child who was meant to save them had grown into a man or woman with a different face. Or perhaps, as Rhaegar once mused, the prophecy's meaning had been misunderstood entirely. On the 5th day of his journey, Arthur reached the outskirts of Starfall at dusk, the sky aglow with pink and orange. From a ridge, he gazed upon the pale stone walls that crowned the steep coastal cliff. The great tower of Starfall, imposing in white stone, stretched toward the heavens. Memories of his youth flooded him. Training in the courtyard with cousins, the clang of steel echoing off warm walls, the laughter of siblings now long gone. He wondered whether the land remembered him. The air still smelled of sea salt and sun-baked rock. The wind across the fortress carried a faint echo of the starlit nights he once cherished, nights spent gazing at the sky from a high tower, dreaming of a world filled with chivalry and valor. He set up camp in a small copse near a trickling stream. Too many patrols guarded Starfall for him to simply ride up. He recognized their banners and sigils from a distance. House Dayne's sigil, the white sword and falling star, still swaying in the ocean breeze. The line of Dayne had not been extinguished, that much was clear, but he did not know the current lord or lady, nor how they would react to an unknown traveler seeking a rumored blade. Sleep was fitful that night, as he weighed plans of infiltration or subterfuge. He loathed the thought of creeping into his own ancestral home like a thief, yet the stakes were too high for the comfort of open introductions. Before first light, he rose and struck camp, determined to find a way inside. Nearby villages seemed subdued. Starfall's overshadowing presence was a constant reminder of authority and tradition. In one such village, set along a rocky hillside, Arthur purchased supplies from a small apothecary. Over stale bread and fresh water, he overheard a conversation between two older men. They spoke of goings-on at the castle. Apparently, visitors had arrived from King's Landing, and the Lord of Starfall had been hosting knights and lords under the pretext of forging alliances. But there was another rumor whispered in the corner of the inn, that House Dayne was preparing to send a champion north to assist in the new wars, and that champion would carry Dawn if the sword deemed him worthy. The men spoke of that last point with reverence. Dawn can only be wielded by the sword of the morning. If the sword does not choose you, you may as well swing a dull piece of iron. Arthur ate in silence, 1,000 thoughts swirling in his head. Dawn still lay in Starfall, he had confirmation. It had not been destroyed or stolen, but to claim it openly, he would need to reveal himself. Could he be recognized? Time had changed him, no doubt, but some might recall the cut of his face, the color of his eyes. More than that, was Starfall even loyal to the Dayne that Arthur had once been? The current generation might consider him a relic at best, a traitor at worst, for having pledged himself so closely to Rhaegar. Still, Arthur had no choice but to proceed. He needed Dawn to face what was coming, and soon. At twilight, when the countryside turned a shade of soft purple under the dying sun, Arthur approached Starfall from a secluded path he recalled from his youth. It wound behind a series of sea bluffs, culminating in a narrow, hidden pass that opened onto the fortress's outer walls. Generations ago, smugglers had used it, or so the rumor went. He found the path overgrown by brambles. Time had rendered it all but forgotten. Carefully, he maneuvered through the thick brush. Each step threatened to snap a twig or send a rock clattering, and he paused often to listen for the footsteps of guards. Yet all he heard was the crashing sea far below and the lonely sigh of wind at dusk. As he crested a final slope, he saw a portion of the castle's outer wall. The stones here were streaked with salt and wind-blasted from centuries of storms rolling off the sunset sea. He spotted no guards directly overhead, though that did not guarantee there were none stationed beyond. The light was fading, and the fortress lanterns were being lit, dotting the ramparts with flickers of gold. Arthur said a silent prayer to the seven, or perhaps to whatever star had gifted House Dayne with its blade, and began his quiet climb. He was still strong, limbs steady, every movement practiced. He ascended the old wall with careful precision, using time-worn cracks between stones as footholds. His breathing deepened with the effort, but he reached the top without accident. Dropping silently onto a deserted walkway, Arthur pressed against the cold stone, his heart pounding. The starlight overhead shimmered. The courtyard beneath was lit by only a handful of torches. He saw a small group of guards, no more than 3, patrolling lazily near a storage building. The main keep stood on the far side, its windows glowing. He remembered exactly where Dawn should be, an ancient vault beneath the Lord's Solar, behind 2 thick doors. Whether it remained in that place or had been moved to the Starry September, he did not know. The challenge would be crossing the courtyard unseen or finding a more subtle route. He circled along the wall, reaching a corner tower. The tower's narrow windows overlooked the interior of the keep. He slipped inside through an unlatched door and found himself in a spiral staircase lit by a single torch. The shadows danced ominously on the walls as he descended. The faint smell of old parchment and dust clung to the air. He realized he must be in or near the old library tower. Memories of times spent reading chivalric tales stirred inside him. The hush here felt sacred, as if the ghosts of knowledge hovered in the gloom. From somewhere below, footsteps echoed. Arthur flattened himself against the curved wall, heart thrumming. The footsteps drew closer, the soft shuffle of leather on stone. In the torchlight, he glimpsed the silhouette of a young man wearing a castle steward's garb. The boy's face was illuminated just enough for Arthur to see he was perhaps 16, with wide eyes scanning a scroll. He moved slowly, murmuring lines to himself, likely practicing a message he was meant to deliver. Arthur stood stock still, blending into the shadows. When the steward passed by, he never glanced up, so immersed in his duty that he failed to notice the silent figure inches away. Arthur exhaled only after the boy's footsteps receded. He continued downward, step after cautious step, until he reached the library corridor. From there, he knew of a discreet walkway that connected to the Lord's Solar on the second floor. It was an architectural quirk of Starfall's design, meant for private passage. If that walkway was still accessible, it could take him closer to Dawn's vault. But as he followed the corridor, he found it barred by a newly installed iron gate. He tested it gently only to discover it was locked. Beyond it, a small hallway stretched in semi-darkness. He cursed under his breath. Another route might be necessary. He considered picking the lock, but that would take time and make noise. He decided to find a different way. Navigating through quiet corridors, he eventually reached a balcony that overlooked the Great Hall. Long rows of tables filled the space, and at the far end was a raised dais for the Lord and his immediate family. The hall was nearly empty at this late hour, but a handful of servants milled about, cleaning up after a supper. Arthur glimpsed a man in the seat of honor, presumably the current Lord Dayne, though from this distance he could not see his face clearly. The Lord was speaking with a guest, their voices too low to distinguish. Arthur did not linger, for he could ill afford detection. He slipped away from the balcony and found another flight of stairs that led down into the heart of the keep. He recalled a time when the fortress felt like his home, each corridor a place of laughter or learning. Now it felt like trespassing in a memory, and yet his purpose steeled him. Dawn was somewhere in these walls. As he moved, he found himself listening for the blade, as if it might sing to him like it once did in battle. Silence persisted, only broken by distant murmurs, the crackle of torches, the hush of night outside. Eventually, he arrived at a small courtyard within the keep. This courtyard was ringed by stone arches and overshadowed by a canopy of climbing vines. If his recollections were correct, a side entrance to the vaults lay behind one of these arches. He tried the door. Locked. Another attempt. Locked. The third entrance, hidden behind a half-dead rose bush, budged slightly under his push. The door creaked, but it opened enough for him to slip inside. He found himself in a short corridor leading downward. The air was colder here, musty with the scent of old stone and stale air. Torches bracketed the walls at intervals, though half of them were unlit, leaving pools of darkness between them. He pressed on, descending deeper into the castle's foundation. This was where House Dayne had kept its treasures and relics for centuries. At last, Arthur reached two large wooden doors reinforced with iron. He placed a hand against them and closed his eyes. This was it, if memory served. Dawn had once been kept here, in a locked chamber lined with velvet-draped walls, a place of reverence. Beyond it, deeper vaults held the bones of ancient family members, genealogical records, and lesser weapons of House Dayne's storied past. If Dawn still existed in Starfall, it would be on the other side of this threshold. He tested the door, found it locked. He had anticipated as much. Carefully, he examined the lock, a sturdy mechanism but not the most complex. Arthur had seen many locks in his years of secrecy, sometimes forced to pick them to acquire food and shelter. He withdrew a thin dagger from his belt and the small pick that hung around his neck on a leather cord. He worked meticulously, every small scrape seeming like a thunderclap in the silence. Once, he froze as he heard steps echo far off in the corridor above. But the steps receded and he continued. At length, the lock gave a faint click, and the doors swung inwards with a groan of hinges that seemed to protest the intrusion. He slipped through and shut them behind him, enveloped in near darkness. The only light came from a single lantern set in a bracket at the far end of the room. He approached it with caution, letting his eyes adjust. The chamber was as he recalled, rectangular, high-ceilinged, the walls adorned with banners depicting the sigil of House Dayne. A few pedestals stood around, displaying old swords under glass. One was a chipped practice sword, supposedly used by the first Dayne squire to become a knight. Another was a graceful, curved blade from Essos, rumored to have been a gift from a visiting Sellsword company centuries ago. But on the largest pedestal at the center of the chamber was a velvet-covered stand. And it was empty. Arthur's heart pounded. He stepped closer, searching for any sign that Dawn had once lain there. The stand was not dusty. It had been used recently. Had the sword been moved? Stolen? Gifted? He closed his eyes, frustrated. Dawn was not here. Perhaps the rumors were true, that the sword had been readied for the champion Starfall intended to send north. Or perhaps it was in the starry September for blessings before the journey. He ran a hand through his graying hair, vexation mounting. He had come so close. He took a moment to examine the chamber thoroughly, passing the lantern's glow along the walls, searching for any clue. At the far corner of the room, he spotted an open chest. Inside were cloth wrappings and the distinctive shape of a scabbard, empty. A faint glimmer of starlight thread was woven along its edge. The scabbard was not new. He recognized it. It was the same scabbard that had once nestled the sword that had made him the Sword of the Morning. The inside of the chest also contained some oils and rags, items used to clean and maintain a sword of such importance. A surge of relief mixed with dread washed over him. Dawn was indeed in active use or about to be. He needed to know where it had been taken. Quietly, he replaced the chest's contents, leaving the scabbard as he had found it, then slipped back into the corridor outside. Perhaps he could eavesdrop or find the new champion's quarters. He had to be cautious, for searching would require more stealth. Time was running short, and if he was discovered, retrieving Dawn might become impossible. He ascended the corridor, emerging again in the shadowy courtyard. As he crossed it, he saw a flicker of light from the door he had come through. He froze. 2 guards stepped into the courtyard, glancing around. Arthur flattened himself against the wall, behind the withered rose bush. He controlled his breathing. One guard muttered something about hearing noises, but the other dismissed it as the wind. After a tense moment, they turned back and left, their torches disappearing around the corner. Arthur exhaled shakily. He needed to be more careful, but the urgency of his quest spurred him on. If the new champion was set to depart for the north, it could happen any day. He had to act swiftly. He decided to climb to the floor of the keep that housed living quarters. Though this route was more public, it was also the most likely place to find out where Dawn had been taken. With measured steps, he scaled a narrow staircase that circled along the outside of the keep, half exposed to the night. Beyond the parapets, the sky stretched wide, star-flecked. He could almost feel the blade's absence, a dull ache in his chest where once the sword's presence had warmed him. On the next level, he found a corridor leading to guest chambers. Voices drifted from beneath one of the doors, light shining from the crack at the threshold. Arthur crept forward, listening. A man's voice. Lord Dayne wants the sword ready by first light. The new champion leaves on the morrow for Highgarden, then continues north. A younger voice answered, uncertain. But is he truly worthy? Dawn has always been rumored to choose its own champion. The older man barked a laugh. He's of Dayne blood, distantly, but that's enough for the ceremony. The sword has not refused him yet, so I see no reason it would do so now. Arthur's mind raced. So House Dayne had found a distant relative, calling him the new Sword of the Morning. Possibly the blade had accepted him, or perhaps tradition was being bent to suit politics. He had no time to reflect on the righteousness of it. If that man left tomorrow, Dawn would be lost to him, carried off on a mission that, while noble, might not utilize the sword to its fullest potential against the creeping undead. Arthur clenched his fists. There was only one path forward. He must confront this new champion and reclaim what was rightfully the realm's, if not his own. Dawn was no mere relic to be tossed into a mortal feud. It was a sword that could stand against the darkness that threatened all life. He waited until the voices receded, then slipped away. He needed a place to wait until the champion emerged. Confronting him in private would be best. Doing so in public would be disastrous. He wandered the dim passages, the hush of night wrapping around him like a cloak. He recalled an old section of the keep, hardly ever visited, used in times of war for strategic vantage. From there, he might keep watch on the champion's departure. If this champion truly bore Dawn, Arthur would see the blade with his own eyes. If he could speak with the champion discreetly, perhaps he could reason with him. If not, well, Arthur had sworn never to raise steel for petty reasons, but the fate of Westeros itself might demand that he do whatever was necessary. Morning came sooner than expected. Arthur dozed in the shadows of a lofted walkway near the stables, hidden behind old crates covered in dust. At dawn, the courtyard beneath began to stir with activity. Horses were led out, saddled and bridled. Servants rushed about carrying supplies. A small retinue assembled. Half a dozen men-at-arms wearing the sigil of House Dayne, well-armed and alert. Then, through the keep's main doors, a tall knight emerged. He wore shining plate armor trimmed in purple and silver. At his waist hung a long, slender sword sheathed in a new scabbard. No, not the starlight scabbard Arthur had seen in the vault, but a simpler one. Arthur's breath caught as the knight adjusted the blade's hilt. The crossguard gleamed pale in the morning sun, and the pommel seemed carved of a milky white stone. It was dawn. Even from a distance, Arthur recognized the sword's singular beauty. Yet something within him twisted in sorrow, for it looked somehow muted, as though it lacked the brilliance it once bore in his own hand. Could it be that the sword had truly accepted this champion? Or was it merely that the champion carried it like any fine blade? Arthur took a steadying breath. He needed to see the man's face, and he needed an opportunity to speak with him alone. The retinue was preparing to depart, the champion speaking briefly with the stablemaster and a castle steward. Arthur inched closer. He could not simply step into the courtyard. He needed to find a vantage to overhear them better. Circling around, he reached the parapet that overlooked the courtyard. The champion removed his helm, revealing a man perhaps in his late 20s, with sandy hair and a serious expression. The steward addressed him as Ser Corran Dayne. The champion nodded curtly, offering instructions for how to handle his personal baggage. See that my banner is affixed to the lead horse. We ride for Highgarden within the hour. The Tyrells must be convinced of the threat in the north. The steward bowed. Yes, my lord. And the sword? Shall I have it wrapped for travel? It is quite valuable. Ser Corran glanced down at Dawn, seeming both awed and burdened by it. No, I'll wear it. A blade like this deserves sunlight, and the men need to see it, to remember what we ride to do. He paused, eyes drifting upward. For a moment, Arthur feared the knight might spot him, but their gazes did not meet. Ser Corran turned away, saying, Our house stands for the realm's protection. If half the rumors about the undead are true, I'll need all the help I can get. Now see to the rest of my gear. Arthur felt a pang of empathy despite the anger and desperation swirling within him. This man was not traveling for personal glory or mere ambition. He genuinely believed in the cause. And yet, Arthur feared that with an untested champion wielding Dawn, the realm might be left vulnerable. Arthur had devoted his entire life to perfecting the art of the sword, to living by a knightly code. He had synergy with Dawn that had been proven in countless battles. Could the Ser Corran truly unlock the sword's potential when the ancient threat finally descended? Arthur needed to know, and if the champion refused to yield the blade willingly, a confrontation would be inevitable. He waited until the retinue was assembled near the gate. Then, as they began to ride out, Arthur slipped from the parapet, moving swiftly to the castle gates ahead of them. He navigated a lesser-known postern door used by servants carrying refuse to be disposed of outside the walls. Then, shrouded by the early morning haze, he waited by the roadside, letting the retinue pass. Ser Corran rode at the front, Dawn bouncing slightly at his hip, catching the morning light in a faint glimmer. Arthur followed at a safe distance, trailing them through dusty roads that wound away from Starfall. He realized they would take the main route north, which eventually ran through a pass leading out of Dorne. The retinue made camp near a small desert oasis that first night. Arthur watched them from afar, hidden behind a rocky outcrop dotted with hardy shrubs. He considered approaching under cover of darkness, but decided against it. Too many men, too little chance for private words. Instead, he waited patiently for morning, then tracked them through the hot, arid day. On the second night, they stopped at another oasis. The routine was the same. Pitch tents, feed the horses, light a small fire for warmth when the desert cooled. Arthur knew he had to act soon. Once they reached a major holdfast or encountered other lords, the champion would be surrounded by more allies, making contact far more difficult. That second night, when the moon was thin overhead and the desert lay still, Arthur crept into the outskirts of the camp. 2 guards sat by the main fire, trading jokes in hushed voices. Another circled the perimeter, footsteps crunching on the sandy ground. Arthur waited until the patrolling guard passed around the far side, then stepped silently into the shadows behind Ser Corin's tent. A single lantern glowed within, the silhouette of the champion faintly visible through the fabric, kneeling in what appeared to be prayer or contemplation. Arthur's pulse quickened. This was his chance. Could he slip inside unseen, speak with Corin in hushed tones? Or should he lure the man away from camp altogether? As he debated, the tent's entrance parted, and Ser Corin stepped out into the moonlight. Arthur pressed himself to the side, heart pounding. Corin was alone, wearing a light tunic and breeches, dawn sheathed at his waist even now. He turned his face skyward, as if searching for guidance among the stars. Arthur stepped forward, risking discovery. In a low voice, he called out, "Ser Corin Dayne." The champion stiffened, hand dropping to the hilt of dawn. "Who's there?" he demanded, voice taut. Arthur spoke slowly, ensuring no one else could hear. "A friend, or at least not an enemy. I mean you no harm. I must speak with you." Corin peered into the darkness, trying to discern the intruder's face. "Show yourself." Arthur emerged into the lantern's edge. His hood was up, shadowing his features. Corin's eyes narrowed. "I've not seen you among my men. State your business, or I'll summon the guard." Arthur raised his hands, palms open in a gesture of peace. "You carry a sword that once belonged to a knight named Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. I must speak with you about that blade." Corin's expression flickered with confusion and a hint of alarm. "And who are you to question that?" He studied Arthur's stance, perhaps sensing some underlying authority in the way the stranger carried himself. "You don't appear a common bandit. But I warn you, I'll not surrender Dawn to a mere thief." Arthur drew a breath. "I'm no thief. Dawn was the sword I once wielded. I have come to reclaim it. The realm depends on it." Corin's mouth opened, closed, and then he let out a disbelieving laugh, though it held no real humor. "Arthur Dayne is dead. I've heard the stories. If this is some attempt at a hoax, you've picked the wrong man to fool." Arthur glanced around, ensuring they were still alone. "I do not expect you to believe me on mere words, yet I stand before you as proof. Let me show you something." He slowly reached up and withdrew the hood. The faint lantern light revealed a face weathered by years, the hair dusted with silver, but undeniably carrying the strong, noble features reminiscent of the Dayne line. "Look at me closely. Do you see the blood of Dayne in my face?" Corin stiffened, eyes wide, uncertain. "Anyone with half our features might claim kinship," he said, though doubt warred with curiosity on his face. "Arthur Dayne died at the Tower of Joy." Arthur stepped closer. "They told that story, yes, but truths have been bent for many reasons. I was gravely wounded. I survived in secret. My vow to protect the prince cost me everything. And now I am here, for I have dreamed of an ancient darkness returning. Dawn must shine anew if the realm is to be saved." For a moment, they stood in tense silence. Then Corin angled his body, half guarding, half wondering. "You speak of the White Walkers, I presume." Everyone has heard the rumors. Arthur nodded. The rumors are real, and that sword is more than just a symbol of House Dayne. It has a part to play in turning back the tide of the dead. I have seen it in visions, and I have felt it. The blade does not glow for me alone. It glows for any who can stand against the darkness. But only one truly worthy can draw out its full power. Corrin's jaw clenched. You imply that I'm not worthy? I don't know you, Arthur said gently. But do you feel its warmth when you touch it? Does it weigh almost nothing in your hand, yet strike with the force of a falling star? Do your instincts align with it as if it's an extension of yourself? If so, you may indeed be worthy. But if not, if you're forcing it, you risk diminishing its potential and endangering the realm. Corrin's gaze dropped to Dawn's hilt. Slowly, he drew the sword, holding it up so the moonlight played along its milky white steel. There was no overt glow, nothing magical to the naked eye, yet it did reflect the starlight in a hauntingly beautiful way. Arthur felt a pang of longing at the sight. How many times had that blade been his partner in the dance of battle? I've trained with it these past weeks, Corrin said quietly. It's a fine sword, but no more. The songs say it should shine like the morning sun. I've never seen that. I thought perhaps that part of the legend was exaggeration. Arthur felt sorrow well in his chest. The sword is alive in a way, he said. It resonates with one who truly becomes the sword of the morning. My father told me as much when I was a boy. It's not about lineage alone, but about the forging of spirit. I claim no perfection, yet I and Dawn were as one in the battles of my youth. If you've not felt that bond, it may be the blade waits for another. Corrin stared at him, expression torn. He was silent for a moment, measuring the older man with searching eyes. At last he said, Suppose you are Arthur Dayne, back from the dead. Even so, Dawn does not belong to you. It belongs to House Dayne. The Lord bestowed it upon me, for I am of Dayne blood. It is my duty to bear it in the coming war. Arthur nodded, refusing to raise his voice. Yes, House Dayne owns it, but the Sword of the Morning is a title, bestowed by the blade's acceptance. That acceptance has not happened here. You sense it. Corrin's hand tightened around the hilt. His posture grew defensive, pride flickering in his eyes. And if I relinquish it to you, what becomes of my oath to my lord? I cannot simply walk back without it. I have men under my command. They expect me to lead them north. If you want the sword, you'll have to duel me for it. Arthur's heart wrenched. He had prayed it would not come to that, but he saw the determination in Corrin's gaze. House Dayne had given him the blade for a reason, and if he simply gave it up, he would feel dishonored. I have no wish to kill a fellow knight, Arthur said, voice hushed. We fight on the same side. We both stand against the horrors stirring in the north. Corrin's face remained set. Then I will not kill you either, but I must defend my right to bear Dawn. He shifted his stance, moving the blade into a guard position. If you truly are Arthur Dayne, you should have no trouble besting me. And if you're an impostor, I shall see the blade remains in worthy hands. Arthur stood still, hands relaxed at his sides. Slowly, he drew the dagger from his belt. One condition, he said. We do not fight to the death. Let the blade decide. If I disarm you, the sword is mine. If you disarm me, I leave you in peace. Agreed. Corrin hesitated, the tension in his jaw easing slightly. Agreed. But if the guards come running, we'll have more than each other to worry about. Arthur nodded. We must move away from the tents. Follow me. They crept carefully into the dunes beyond the flicker of the campfires, the moon casting ghostly shadows across the rippling sand. The hush of the desert enfolded them. They stood facing each other in that silent night, two men of House Dayne, separated by generations and secrets, yet united by purpose. Arthur studied Corrin's stance. The young knight had a good posture, clearly practiced. Dawn gleamed faintly, even in the dim light, a slender extension of his arm. Arthur held only his dagger, a short, plain weapon compared to the star-forged steel. Yet he had fought many times with shorter blades against longer swords, and in the end, Skill often tipped the balance over steel. They circled each other. A faint breeze lifted the sand around their feet. The hush was broken only by their measured breaths. Then Corrin lunged, a swift thrust aiming for Arthur's midsection. Arthur sidestepped, pivoting smoothly, letting the blade hiss past him. He tapped Corrin's wrist with the flat of the dagger, redirecting the sword's momentum. Corrin recovered quickly, swinging Dawn in an arc that forced Arthur to duck low. Arthur felt the rush of air as the blade cut overhead. Though older, Arthur's reflexes were honed by a lifetime of battles. He danced backward, raising the dagger to parry. The clash of metal rang in the stillness. Corrin pressed forward aggressively, determined to prove his worth. Arthur gave ground, deflecting blow after blow, each clang reverberating with tension. The younger knight's attacks were vigorous, but Arthur sensed a lack of fluidity in how Corrin wielded Dawn. He was skilled, but the synergy with the blade simply wasn't there. Arthur seized an opening. Corrin overextended on a sideways slash, leaving his left flank briefly exposed. Arthur slipped inside Corrin's guard and tapped the pommel of the dagger against the knight's ribs. It was a non-lethal strike, but enough to send a jolt of surprise through Corrin. He staggered, regrouping with a frustrated grunt. "You fight well," he breathed. Arthur said nothing, focusing on the intangible dialogue between bodies and steel. A part of him felt sorrowful that this was how he reunited with Dawn, as an adversary in a moonlit desert, blade turning against blade of the same house. But necessity drove him on. Corrin attacked again, more cautiously now. He tried a feint to the leg, then sliced upward. Arthur blocked with a sure hand, stepping in close. Their hilts locked, the men face to face, each straining against the other's strength. In the faint moonlight, Corrin stared into Arthur's eyes, searching for signs of deception or weakness. Arthur's gaze was calm, though sweat beaded on his brow. With a sudden twist, Arthur angled the dagger to lever Dawn's blade aside. At the same moment, he swept a foot behind Corrin's ankle. The younger knight stumbled, toppling onto the sand. Dawn nearly slipped from his grasp, but Corrin clung to the hilt. Arthur stepped back, allowing him to rise. The dance continued, dust swirling around their feet. They exchanged blows, parries, and swift counters. Corrin used both hands on Dawn for power, while Arthur relied on timing and skill to compensate for his shorter weapon. Finally, after a particularly savage overhead strike from Corrin, Arthur pivoted with uncanny grace, stepping to the side and striking Corrin's sword arm with his open palm. The shock forced Corrin's grip to loosen. A heartbeat later, Arthur brought the dagger's hilt down hard on Corrin's wrist. Dawn tumbled into the sand. Without hesitation, Arthur kicked the blade away. Corrin lunged for it, but Arthur gripped his tunic from behind, pulling him back gently. "It's done," Arthur panted. "Yield." Corrin's chest heaved, muscles quivering with exertion. Slowly, he relaxed, nodding in reluctant acceptance. "I yield." His voice was strained with both physical effort and wounded pride. Arthur released him, then bent to pick up Dawn. For a moment, Arthur stared at the sword's pale surface. He turned it in the moonlight. It was cool to the touch, yet as he closed his eyes, he sensed a faint thrum, like an echo of distant thunder within the metal. A wave of memory came over him. The years of training at Starfall, the brilliance of the blade under the scorching Dornish sun, the tragic day at the Tower of Joy. He swallowed hard, then spoke softly. "I didn't want this to happen, but I can't let Dawn travel with one who is not fully attuned to it, not when the fate of the living is at stake." Corrin rose unsteadily, cradling his sore wrist. He looked at the older knight with an expression torn between anger, awe, and curiosity. "If you are truly Arthur Dayne, what do you plan to do with the sword? You said something about forging it anew?" Arthur nodded, eyes still on the blade. "This is not an ordinary foe we face. The Night King, the White Walkers. If half the tales are true, they can only be turned by dragon steel or dragon glass. Valyrian steel is also rumored to harm them, and Dawn, I suspect, has a similar property. Perhaps it once came from the same cosmic forces that shaped dragonglass or Valyrian steel. But I believe it can be reforged or enhanced to become an even mightier weapon against the undead. Corrin's eyes flickered. Reforged? Are you mad? This sword is a relic. To melt it down would be heresy to our house. Arthur's grip tightened on the hilt. I would never defile Dawn, but I recall from old texts that the heat of dragonfire can reshape certain magical metals, forging them into a form more potent against the cold. Dawn may need such forging if we are to face an army of the dead. And there are rumors a Targaryen queen rides dragons in the north. Corrin stared at him, the initial outrage receding into thoughtfulness. You mean to present this sword to her dragons and reforge it as what? A new Lightbringer? Arthur shook his head. I don't know if it will become Lightbringer. Legends can be deceptive. But I do know that if anything can stand against the ice, it is a sword forged of star metal and tempered in dragonfire. That is the path before me now. If I fail, the entire realm may suffer. Corrin looked down at his empty hands, then at Arthur. And what becomes of House Dayne's authority over the blade? Our entire lineage is defined by it. Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder. Help me. Come north with me. Let us show your lord that the sword must face the threat beyond the wall. Once the war is done, if I survive, I will return Dawn to Starfall, to be placed in your care again, if the sword wills it. Corrin's stance sagged with the weight of conflicting loyalties. His sense of honor, his allegiance to House Dayne, and his genuine desire to fight the undead all warred within him. At length he let out a long breath. I gave my oath to Lord Dayne to bear the sword north. But if you truly are the rightful sword of the morning, if the blade has chosen you once more, then I will accompany you, not as its bearer, but as your ally. I must see this quest done. If the living are indeed at risk, we cannot afford half measures. Arthur felt a rush of gratitude, though tempered by the knowledge of the difficult path ahead. Thank you, he said earnestly. We will ride together. When the time comes, I will speak with your men. I hope to do so peacefully without violence. If you vouch for me, perhaps we can avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Corrin nodded. You disarmed me without drawing my blood. Let that be a testament. I will do what I can. My men trust me. If I explain that our cause requires a more seasoned champion, they may stand down. But we should do it quietly, carefully, or risk humiliating House Dayne's leadership. They stood in silence for a moment, the enormity of their task settling over them like the cold desert wind. Arthur placed Dawn back into the simpler scabbard. The weight on his hip felt strangely familiar, as though no time had passed. A sense of resolve filled him, and the stirring of something deeper, a faint resonance, as if the blade recognized him once more, though still subdued, waiting to shine. They returned to camp under the moon's watchful eye, making as little noise as possible. Corrin gathered his personal belongings and parted quietly with a few choice men, giving them discreet instructions to remain loyal to him. He spun a quick story that they were to accompany a revered knight of House Dayne to a more pressing engagement in the north, while the rest would continue to Highgarden on diplomatic errands. In the darkness, the small group slipped away, leaving the bulk of the retinue unsuspecting. By dawn's light, Arthur, Corrin, and a handful of loyal companions were well on their way, forging a secret path north, Dawn at Arthur's side. The road from Dorne to the Reach was harsh, crossing stony passes and sun-scorched plains. The small company traveled swiftly, speaking little during the day, pressing onward. At night, around a modest campfire, they cautiously shared information. Corrin's men, 3 of them, were cautious around Arthur, uncertain what to make of this older knight with the quiet dignity and the fabled sword. But Corrin vouched for him, and Arthur's own bearing inspired a measure of respect. They made good time, eventually reaching the fertile borders of the Reach. The shift from desert to green farmland felt like a dream. Rolling meadows, vibrant crops, winding rivers. Yet Arthur could not shake a sense of urgency. Each passing day brought the undead threat closer. He had heard that the Great War might have already begun in the north, that the Night King led an army of thousands, unstoppable except by a handful of dragonglass weapons and the combined might of living armies. If that was true, forging a new blade was of the essence. One evening, Arthur noticed Corin studying him intently as they broke camp. The younger knight seemed to wrestle with a question. At last, he spoke, voice low so as not to rouse the others. "You truly believe the Night King can be defeated by forging dawn anew? What if the forging fails, or the dragons refuse us their flame?" Arthur looked up, the fading light of sunset reflecting in his eyes. "I can't be certain, but I once fought alongside Prince Rhaegar, who believed in the prince that was promised. He believed the champion would wield a sword of fire. Perhaps it's not a single champion, but all of us together. Dawn, dragons, the men of the realm united, maybe that is the true prophecy. Regardless, we must try." They pressed on. Rumors reached them that Highgarden had thrown its support behind a new Targaryen claim, that the Lords of the Reach were rallying under the Queen with dragons. Arthur recalled meeting Aerys and Rhaella Targaryen in his youth, though it seemed so long ago now. The thought of dragons returning to Westeros after so many years sparked both hope and apprehension. Dragons were not easy to control, nor were they guaranteed to yield their flame for the forging of a single sword. But if the Queen was wise, if she sought every advantage against the undead, she might see reason in Arthur's request. As the small band traveled, they came upon a road teeming with refugees. Farmers, peasants, minor lords who had abandoned their lands further north. The stories they carried were grim. Whole villages left deserted. A biting cold creeping south. Strange creatures glimpsed on lonely roads at night. Arthur's mouth set in a grim line as he listened to these tales. The war was no longer rumor. It was a living nightmare for thousands. One twilight, they encountered a band of northern soldiers, dirty and exhausted, heading south to beg allies for reinforcements. The soldiers' leader, a burly man with a worn face, told them that Winterfell was locked in desperate struggle. The Night King's forces had battered the northern defenses, and the living needed every blade. "If you're going north, hurry," the man warned. "We lost plenty already, and the dead don't rest." Arthur thanked him quietly. No mention was made of who carried Dawn. They continued onward, dread mingling with determination. At last, under a storm-gray sky, they approached the outskirts of a great military encampment that sprawled across rolling fields. Banners bearing the sigil of the Golden Rose fluttered in the breeze, interspersed with other sigils from across the reach. Soldiers drilled with spears, horses snorted in picket lines, and the hum of massed humanity filled the air with tension and anticipation. Word had spread that the Targaryen queen was marching north, accompanied by lords from Dorne, the Stormlands, and the Reach who had bent the knee or sworn alliances. Dragons were rumored to have been seen overhead days before. Arthur and his companions entered the camp carefully, passing through rows of tents, ignoring the curious glances of men preparing for war. At the center of the encampment, near a large green and gold pavilion, a crowd gathered around tall standards. Surrounded by knights of House Tyrell stood a woman of striking presence, her silver-gold hair braided in the style of old Valyria. She wore practical armor, and her bearing was both regal and alert. This was Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen. Arthur felt a strange mixture of awe and nostalgia as he gazed upon her. She bore echoes of Rhaegar's features, though her spirit felt different, steel tempered by exile and hardship. If the old prophecies had any truth, it might be here, in this woman, or in those who fought beside her. He and Corin dismounted. The Dayne men followed, uncertain. They approached the assembled group, where lords and knights petitioned for the queen's attention. A herald blocked their path, glaring at the strangers. Name and purpose? Arthur stepped forward, inclining his head respectfully. "We come from Dorne, bearing important news about a sword that may help defeat the undead." Some of the knights nearby scoffed or rolled their eyes. Everyone had important news these days, but something in Arthur's composure, or perhaps the glint of the sword at his hip, made the herald hesitate. He turned to one of the queen's advisors, a tall man with dark, braided hair and a curious expression. "Ser Jorah," the herald said uncertainly, These men claim to bear a sword from Dorne that can fight the undead. Ser Jorah Mormont, for that was who it seemed to be, approached with measured steps. He looked the older knight up and down, gaze lingering on Dawn's pale hilt. "You bear a fine blade, Ser. What do you know of the undead that the queen must hear?" Arthur met his eyes steadily. "More than I wish I did. I am Arthur Dayne." A murmur ran through the assembled. Some scoffed outright, recalling the famously dead Kingsguard. Arthur pressed on. "And this sword is Dawn, the ancestral blade of House Dayne. We believe it can be reforged with dragonfire to stand against the Night King." Daenerys, overhearing the commotion, turned her head sharply. Her violet eyes flicked toward the group. She made a small gesture, and the crowd parted enough to grant Arthur and his companions a direct line of approach. Arthur bowed respectfully, not prostrating himself in the manner of lesser men but offering a knight's courtesy to the queen. Qhorin and the other Dayne men followed suit. Daenerys studied them with an unreadable expression. "Arthur Dayne died years ago," she said calmly. "Why do you claim his name?" Arthur could sense the tension, the suspicion in the air. Here was a woman who had navigated countless betrayals and illusions. "Your Grace," he said, "I served Prince Rhaegar Targaryen as a Kingsguard. I guarded your family's interests. My death was reported after the battle at the Tower of Joy. The truth is more complicated. I survived at great cost and went into hiding. I cannot prove this with a simple word. But I bring you the sword Dawn, which only the sword of the morning may rightfully bear. Whether you believe me or not, I ask you to let me prove the sword's worth against the undead." A hush descended. Many eyes fell on the pale blade at Arthur's hip. It seemed to shimmer in the overcast daylight. Daenerys looked to her advisors. Tyrion Lannister stood at her side, brow furrowed in thought. "If this is indeed Arthur Dayne," Tyrion began, "then perhaps the sword is genuine. But we must confirm. House Dayne of Starfall might settle the matter, though if the man claims to have traveled incognito, who can speak for him?" Qhorin stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I am Qhorin Dayne, recognized by the Lord of Starfall. I was given Dawn to bear north, until this night bested me. He wields it now, and the sword seems to resonate with him in a way it never did with me. That, as far as House Dayne is concerned, suggests there is truth to his identity. The sword chooses its bearer." Daenerys studied Qhorin's earnest face, then Arthur's composed demeanor. "If House Dayne supports you, then you have my attention. Now, about reforging the blade, what exactly do you propose?" Arthur dared to take a small step closer, voice calm but filled with quiet conviction. "Legend says that dragonfire was used to forge Valyrian steel in ancient times. Dawn predates even that knowledge, having been forged from the heart of a fallen star. I believe that by exposing it to dragonfire again, or by melding it with Valyrian forging techniques, we can awaken properties that might be crucial in stopping the undead. The White Walkers are vulnerable to dragonglass, Valyrian steel, and possibly other forms of magic. This sword is magical in origin, but I feel it's dormant. We need to rekindle its light." Daenerys' expression was contemplative. She glanced at Tyrion, then at Ser Jorah, who in turn shared uncertain looks. Finally, she spoke, voice carrying the weight of a queen who must weigh all possibilities. "We march north soon to join forces at Winterfell. The forging of a single blade, no matter how powerful, might not turn the tide alone. But perhaps it can help. We will have little time to attempt such forging, though. Once we're in the thick of battle, you must be prepared to fight. My dragons, Drogon Regal, are not smith's tools. Their fire is savage, and controlling it precisely is no small feat." Arthur inclined his head in understanding. "I ask only for the chance to try, Your Grace. If it fails, I'll fight with whatever steel I have. But if it succeeds, we may gain a weapon that can turn the tide in the darkest hour." There was a pause, pregnant with expectation. Finally, Daenerys nodded. "Very well. Accompany us north. Once we've established a secure position, if circumstances allow, we will see if the dragons can reforge your sword. And if you prove false..." She let the threat linger. Arthur bowed, a hand over his heart. "I will prove true," he said simply. The next days were a flurry of activity. Arthur, Corin, and the Dayne men integrated into the Queen's forces. Supplies were organized, last-minute recruits sworn in, alliances solidified. Arthur found himself in a strange swirl of half-familiar Targaryen devotion and new alliances that had formed in his absence. He watched Daenerys from afar sometimes, remembering Rhaegar's quiet intensity. She was different, hardened by adversity, a breaker of chains. The realm might need that. Tyrion's cunning, Ser Jorah's unwavering loyalty, Grey Worm's silent discipline, and the presence of other lords all formed a tapestry of cautious hope. They set out for Winterfell, a grand host streaming across the green fields of the Reach. The journey took them through narrower roads and eventually across the Neck, where the landscape grew cold and damp. Arthur felt a shiver of foreboding as they traveled farther north, the air tinged with frost. Dawn remained at his side, still quiet, awaiting the moment it might either shine or prove only an ordinary blade. Corin rode beside him, the tension between them eased into a mutual respect. "I never expected to follow another man," Corin admitted softly. "But you fight like the legends say." Arthur allowed a small smile. "And you do House Dayne credit with your loyalty. If all goes well, we'll stand side by side against the dead." Corin nodded, though worry clouded his eyes. The deeper they moved into the north, the starker the reality of the war became. The roads were littered with signs of urgent retreat. Camps of refugees dotted the wayside, burning scraps of whatever firewood they could scavenge. Soldiers looked gaunt and haunted, telling horror stories of skirmishes with whites. Winter fell heavy, the sky often gray, the breath of men visible in the frigid air. After a long and grueling march, the host reached Winterfell's outer fields. There, they beheld a sobering sight. The castle's walls were reinforced with newly erected wooden barriers, trenches lined with dragonglass stakes, and watchtowers manned day and night. The living had braced themselves for the storm of death. Daenerys' army was met by the forces loyal to the king in the north, and though tensions ran high, Northerners were ever distrustful of outsiders. They soon recognized the absolute necessity of unity in the face of annihilation. Arthur stood before the great gates of Winterfell, memories of Eddard Stark flooding his mind. He wondered if Ned's children would greet him, if they would recognize the man who had once dueled their father. He felt a pang for the friend and foe who had ended his rumored life, forging a bittersweet bond that was the stuff of legends. He prayed that the living would hold fast against the unstoppable tide. Within days, ravens brought dire news. The Night King's army was closer than expected, and outriders had spotted white incursions in the near forests. Daenerys lost no time. Under the black sky of a winter evening, she summoned Arthur to a secluded courtyard behind Winterfell, where stone walls offered some privacy. There, two of her dragons awaited. Drogon and Rhaegal, each the size of a small hall, their reptilian eyes glowing with primal fire. The heat radiating from their bodies starkly contrasted the biting cold in the air. Arthur approached them slowly, heart pounding. He had faced skilled knights, monstrous men, even legendary creatures in stories, but never a living dragon. Daenerys stood with them, her face half-lit by torchlight. Tyrion, Ser Jorah, and a handful of others looked on anxiously, including a few smiths who had come to offer any assistance they could. Daenerys gestured at the sword at Arthur's side. "Show me Dawn." Arthur drew it, feeling the hush of the night intensify. The pale blade glimmered. The dragons stirred, their massive heads snaking forward to observe the strange metal. Arthur felt their hot breath on his skin, fighting the instinct to flinch. An uneasy hush fell upon everyone present. "The forging of Valyrian steel involves arcane knowledge lost to time," Tyrion said quietly. "We can't replicate that precisely, but we do know that an intense heat can rework certain magical metals. If Dawn is star metal, perhaps the dragon's flame can stoke it to a malleable state." One of the smiths, a grizzled man with burned scars, nodded. "Aye, but we need a real forge to hammer it." Dragonfire alone won't shape the steel. We can try to heat it in a specially prepared furnace, then bring it out for forging. But with this cold, and so little time, it's a gamble. Daenerys lifted her hand, catching Drogon's attention. The massive dragon emitted a low rumble. "We cannot wait for a perfect moment," the queen said. "The army of the dead comes soon. If we're to do this, we do it now, here, under the open sky if need be." Arthur looked at the blade in his hand, feeling its silent pulse. "I am ready," he said. A makeshift forge was quickly assembled. The smiths rigged up a large stone trough and bellows, using coals from Winterfell's smithy, reinforced by the intense heat of dragonflame. They worked through the night, fueling it to a temperature that no normal forge could reach. Sparks whirled upward in the frigid air, and the glow of the coals cast eerie shadows on the ancient walls. Daenerys directed the dragons carefully, letting them exhale controlled bursts of flame to superheat the coals, the smiths stepping back in awe and trepidation. Arthur stood by, dawn in hand, heart hammering. Corran, Tyrion, and Yora watched, each uncertain but hopeful. Finally, the smith motioned to Arthur. "Put the blade in," he said, voice ragged. Arthur approached the inferno, feeling the waves of scalding heat wash over him. He pressed the tip of dawn into the coals. The metal glowed faintly, turning a sullen red under the intense temperature. Gradually, he immersed more of the blade. Sweat poured off him despite the freezing night. Sparks danced around his hands. Dawn glowed brighter, shifting from red to almost white-hot. Arthur's arms trembled with the effort of holding the sword steady. He felt something deep within the metal begin to resonate. A tingling pressure filled his ears. The watchers murmured in awe. As the blade reached a near-blinding brightness, one of the dragons, regal, craned its neck and breathed a tongue of flame onto the coals. The roar was deafening. Heat flared impossibly high, and Arthur grit his teeth, refusing to let go. The forging moment had arrived. The smith gestured frantically. "Now! Remove the blade and hammer it." Quickly, Arthur withdrew Dawn from the coals, the blade pulsing with heat, edges shimmering with raw potential. He brought it to an anvil set on a massive slab of stone. Another smith raised a heavy hammer and struck it once, a resounding clang that sent a shower of sparks flying. A flash of brilliance illuminated the courtyard, and Arthur felt the blade almost writhe under the hammer's blow. The second strike came, then a third. Each hammer fall rang with a note that wasn't just metal. There was a strange musical resonance, as if the sword itself was singing in agony or ecstasy. Arthur felt sweat drench his brow, the stifling heat battling the biting cold. The watchers stood transfixed, some shielding their eyes from the glare. Daenerys, her face drawn with concentration, signaled Drogon for another burst of flame. The black dragon roared, pouring more fire onto the coals, intensifying the furnace's heat. The smith hammered again, trying to shape or refine the blade's edges without shattering its magical essence. Moments stretched into a timeless dance of elemental forces. Star metal, dragonfire, and the living will of the men striving to craft a weapon for an apocalyptic war. At last, the lead smith stepped back, panting, his hammer arm trembling. "If it takes any more forging, we risk cracking it," he warned. Arthur looked at the blade, now red-hot and glowing with internal fire. "Quench it," the smith said, pointing to a trough of oil and water mixed with dragonglass shards. No one quite knew if that would aid or harm the magic, but it was a desperate attempt to bind the properties of the blade with the known weakness of the undead. Arthur plunged the white-hot metal into the trough. Steam erupted in a furious hiss, swirling around them in a cloud. The courtyard erupted in pandemonium as men coughed and shielded their faces from the blistering spray. When the steam cleared, Arthur withdrew the blade. The metal no longer glowed with raw heat, yet there was something changed in its surface. The pale color was still there, but threads of a darker, almost iridescent pattern ran along the fuller. It was as though the star metal and dragonglass had fused in places, forging a swirling mosaic. Arthur turned the sword, the edges catching the torchlight. The watchers fell silent. "Is it done?" Daenerys asked quietly, stepping forward. Arthur gripped the hilt, feeling an electric hum travel from the blade into his arm. "I believe so, Your Grace," he said, voice tight with wonder. "But the true test will be in battle." Qhorin approached, gazing at the reforged sword with awe. "Does it still feel like dawn?" he asked. Arthur nodded, though he sensed a new presence in the metal. "It feels more, as if it pulses with both the memory of the star it came from and the flames of the dragon that tempered it." Daenerys allowed herself a small smile. Tyrion exhaled slowly, tension leaving his shoulders. The smith slumped to the ground, exhausted. Everyone sensed they had witnessed something extraordinary, perhaps even legendary. Yet it was a single sword, among thousands of men, standing against an endless tide of death. Arthur placed a hand on the pommel, a quiet vow forming in his mind. "If this sword can slow or stop the Night King, I will wield it with every ounce of my being, or die trying." That night, word spread through the camp of a newly forged blade, rumored to be the second coming of Lightbringer or a cousin to Valyrian steel. Soldiers whispered that Arthur Dayne himself had returned from the grave, a champion to fight the endless night. Some dismissed it as superstitious nonsense. Others clung to it as a spark of hope. As darkness spread across the sky, the living made ready for war. Within a day, the horns sounded. Scouts reported the Night King's forces drawing near. A wave of undead wights, led by icy generals on pale horses, approached Winterfell. Defenses were manned, catapults loaded, trenches lit. The living braced themselves in the bitter cold, the ground beneath them frozen and the sky thick with clouds. Arthur stood atop Winterfell's ramparts, the reforged dawn strapped across his back, its presence like a living heartbeat. Qhorin and the Dayne men remained close, determined to fight at his side. Daenerys' dragons soared overhead, watchful and menacing against the ashen sky. The queen herself would coordinate the aerial onslaught, while the knights and armies would hold the castle walls. The enemy appeared on the horizon like a black sea, thousands of undead figures shambling forward in eerie silence. The living's hearts pounded in unison, a collective dread. An unnatural chill crept across the fields, snuffing out warmth. The men at arms readied their weapons, dragon-glass-tipped spears glinting. Archers nocked arrows, eyes wide with fear. Arthur drew dawn, the new steel catching a faint glimmer of the dying light. He felt the blade resonate, as if hungry for the coming battle. A roar tore through the sky as Drogon and Rhaegal descended, unleashing columns of fire upon the leading ranks of the undead. Whole swaths burned, collapsing into ash. Yet the wave pressed on, unrelenting. The White Walkers emerged, tall and lithe, their eyes shining the color of frozen blue flame. One of them raised an icy spear, hurling it at Rhaegal. The dragon wheeled aside, shrieking in pain as the spear grazed a wing. The living answered with catapults and burning pitch, trying to slow the inexorable advance. Arthur's heart thudded. This was not a battle of men, but of existence itself. He felt the call to charge, to meet the undead with steel. The gates opened for the cavalry's counterattack. Arthur swung onto his horse, dawn in hand, leading a small contingent, Qhorin among them, into the fray. As they galloped across the battlefield, the cold wind sliced at their faces. They slammed into the wights, swords flashing. Dawn sang in Arthur's grip, carving through rotting flesh and brittle bone as if it cut through shadows. Where the blade struck, wights crumpled in puffs of icy dust. He felt no weight, no drag, just the unstoppable precision of a weapon that had been fashioned for this very moment. A wight lunged at him, mouth gaping, a rusted sword in hand. Arthur parried, severing its arm in one fluid motion. Another advanced on his flank, but he reversed his grip and impaled it cleanly. Beside him, Qhorin fought bravely, though even with dragonglass steel, he couldn't match Arthur's lethal grace. Still, the undead swarms threatened to overwhelm them. Horses screamed, pulled down by claws. Knights fell, pinned beneath writhing corpses, some devoured alive. The stench of decay, the cries of the dying, the roar of dragons overhead. It was chaos incarnate. Arthur pressed on, forging a path through the ranks of the dead, seeking the White Walkers themselves. If he could face one with Dawn, it might break them as Valyrian steel was known to. He spotted a tall figure in the swirling snow, eyes aglow with malice. Spurring his horse forward, Arthur unleashed a fierce slash. The White Walker raised an ice-forged blade to meet his strike. Steel met ice in a shower of sparks and frost. The Walker's blade shrieked, fracturing under Dawn's impact. Arthur felt a jolt of energy surge through the sword, as if it devoured the cold essence of the Walker's weapon. Undeterred, the Walker dodged backward with uncanny speed, forming a new spear of ice in its hand. Arthur dismounted, stepping onto the blood-soaked field. Man and inhuman creature faced each other amid the storm of death. Snow whipped around them, and the White Walker thrust the spear with inhuman speed. Arthur parried, metal singing against brittle ice. A second thrust aimed for his heart, but he twisted aside, the spear scraping across his armor. Pressing forward, Arthur unleashed a flurry of strikes, each testing the Walker's guard. The creature snarled in eerie silence, parrying with unnatural grace. Yet Dawn felt unstoppable in Arthur's hands. Each blow resonated with the forging of star metal and dragonfire. The Walker's spear cracked under the repeated impact. Sensing an opening, Arthur spun, bringing Dawn in a sweeping arc that severed the Walker's torso. For a heartbeat, the creature's body froze in place, then shattered like glass, shards of ice scattering across the snow. Arthur stood, panting, the sword radiating a faint glow. One White Walker down, countless more to go. Looking around, Arthur saw the living locked in a desperate struggle. The cavalry charge had halted. Men found themselves besieged by endless waves of undead. On the ramparts, archers loosed arrow after arrow, but each volley only felled a fraction of the horde. Daenerys soared overhead on Drogon, her flames scything through clusters of whites, but the Night King was not yet visible. The entire field was a maelstrom of chaos and cold, men and monsters locked in a dance of life and death. Arthur found Corran among the carnage, pulling him free from a knot of whites. The younger knight was battered, but still defiant. Together they fought toward Winterfell's walls, seeking a momentary reprieve. Arthur shouted for the men to regroup. It was nearly impossible to coordinate in the swirling melee, but small pockets of living soldiers managed to rally under the banner of the Sword of the Morning. Dawn's glow provided them a beacon of hope in the gloom. The night wore on. Ice spread across the ground, and patches of flame guttered in the relentless wind. The living were pushed back, yard by yard, until they found themselves at Winterfell's outer trenches. A second line of defense blazed with fire as the trenches were ignited, halting the whites momentarily. But still the tide pressed. Over the roar of battle, a horn blasted. A warning from the castle's highest tower. The silhouette of the Night King appeared in the distance, mounted on an undead dragon that spewed frigid breath, extinguishing fires below. Arthur's blood ran cold. This was the real threat. Slaying White Walkers helped, but if the Night King raised the dead anew, all their efforts might be undone. As if on cue, the battered corpses littering the field twitched, rising again under the Night King's power. Fallen knights, old whites, all reanimated to surge at the living once more. Despair tugged at Arthur. Even with a sword of dragons and stars, how could they triumph against such an overwhelming force? A thunderous roar split the sky. Regal, wing injured but still aloft, dove toward the undead dragon. The two beasts clashed in midair, tearing at each other with claws and fangs. Daenerys circled on Drogon, trying to find an opening to unleash fire on the Night King. Meanwhile, on the ground, Arthur and the living fought on, inch by bloody inch. Dawn cut down whites in droves. Those who witnessed Arthur's skill felt a surge of morale, rallying around him in a last stand. Time blurred into a frenzy of steel and bone. Arthur's limbs ached, his breath ragged. Blood from the fallen slicked the ground, turning it treacherous. He saw men he had shared fires with lying still and silent, or worse, rising again to attack their former comrades. He pressed onward, refusing to yield. Each slash of dawn cast a faint flash, as if starfire lanced through the gloom. Qhorin stumbled, pinned by a wight. Arthur lunged, severing the creature's spine, hauling Qhorin to his feet. "Stay with me," Arthur shouted over the din. Qhorin nodded, face pale and determined. A shriek overhead drew Arthur's gaze skyward. The undead dragon spat icy breath at Regal, and the green dragon's roar echoed in pain. The Night King, perched on the undead beast's back, lifted a spear of ice, taking aim. Daenerys urged Drogon forward, unleashing a torrent of flame that momentarily engulfed the Night King. But in a horrifying display of power, he emerged unscathed from the fire, hurling the spear at Drogon. The spear grazed the dragon's flank, sending Daenerys spiraling away, barely maintaining her seat. Winterfell's defenders faltered, hope slipping away. Arthur's heart hammered with fury and desperation. He remembered Rhaegar's convictions, the prophecy of a hero with a burning blade. Maybe that hero was not a single person, but all those who fought with unwavering resolve. He raised dawn, meeting eyes with the men around him. "For the realm!" he cried, voice raw. The battered knights, the frightened peasants wielding makeshift spears, even Qhorin, battered and bloody, echoed his cry. They surged once more into the fray, forging a narrow path toward the open field, where the Night King circled overhead. Amid the swirling snow and swirling dead, Arthur realized what must be done. The Night King had to be confronted. Dawn had the power to destroy White Walkers. Perhaps it could end the Night King's reign. A glimmer of memory surfaced. The original forging of Lightbringer by Azor Ahai, who drove his blade into the heart of darkness. Arthur's jaw set. He would do whatever it took. With a wild determination, he guided his horse beyond the broken lines, weaving through wights that lunged at him from all sides. Qhorin and a few loyal fighters followed, forming a wedge around him. They cut down the undead in a furious dance of steel, inching closer to the area beneath the Night King's monstrous mount. Under a swirling storm of ice and shadow, the Night King and his dragon descended. A blast of freezing breath rolled across the ground, freezing men solid, shattering them as they fell. Arthur and his companions narrowly avoided the wave, veering aside. The undead dragon landed with a thunderous crash, the ground trembling. The Night King dismounted gracefully, standing among the carnage. His blue eyes glowed with a malevolent calm, as if this entire battle was merely an inevitability to him. Arthur dismounted, swallowing the lump of terror in his throat. Dawn's reforged edge gleamed with an otherworldly sheen. The night was still around them, as if the battlefield held its breath in anticipation of this final confrontation. The Night King tilted his head, observing Arthur with what might have been curiosity or contempt. Slowly, Arthur raised the blade in challenge. The ancient enemy raised a hand. A new wave of the dead lurched up from the snow, encircling them. "Protect him," Arthur barked to Qhorin, who nodded, rallying their small group to hold off the wights. Sword of dragons and stars in hand, Arthur advanced on the Night King. Every step felt heavy with destiny, yet he summoned all the skill, all the courage, that had once made him the greatest knight of his era. The Night King conjured an icy blade from thin air, its surface crackling with dark magic. They clashed. The first strike shook Arthur to his core, the reverberation traveling up his arms. He gritted his teeth, returning the blow with all his might. Dawn shone, slicing through the cold as if forging a path of light. Their duel was swift, silent, brutal. Each swing of the Night King's blade threatened to encase Arthur's limbs in frost. Each counter from Dawn chipped away at the unnatural ice. Starlight flared, or perhaps it was only the reflection of steel in the gloom, but Arthur felt the sword hum with each impact, as if hungry to break the darkness. Around them, men screamed and fell, the undead pressed in. Qhorin and the others fought valiantly, buying Arthur precious moments. Arthur saw an opening. The Night King's blade had chipped under repeated strikes from Dawn. With a surge of will, Arthur lunged, driving the reforged steel toward the creature's heart. But in a flash of supernatural speed, The Night King sidestepped, swinging his ice blade at Arthur's exposed flank. Arthur twisted, taking the blow on his pauldron. Pain flared as the cold bit through metal, but he held firm, hooking the crossguard of dawn under the Night King's blade, snapping off a chunk of ice. The Night King reeled back, momentarily off balance. This was his chance. Arthur mustered every ounce of strength and plunged Dawn forward, aiming for the Night King's center. The creature raised an arm in defense, ice forming into a jagged shield. Dawn sliced through it, unstoppable, until the blade sank into the Night King's chest. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. Arthur locked eyes with the inhuman king, seeing a flash of something like surprise, or perhaps fury. Then Dawn flared. A burst of energy radiated outward, and the Night King's body cracked, spiderweb lines of frost splintering across him. A soundless explosion of cold and light coursed through the air. Arthur was thrown back by the force, tumbling into the snow. His vision spun, ears ringing. When he struggled to his feet, the Night King was on his knees, icy fissures spreading across his form. Slowly, as though time itself were fracturing, the ancient being shattered into a million shards. The undead dragon roared, thrashing before collapsing into lifeless bone. Across the battlefield, wights disintegrated, their stolen animation extinguished. A wave of silence rolled over Winterfell, the dead returning to the stillness from which they had been wrenched. Arthur stood, battered and gasping, Dawn still clutched in his hand. The battlefield lay silent, save for the ragged sobs of survivors and the crackle of fires. In that moment, dawn broke over the horizon. Pale light swept across the bloodied snow. Arthur held the sword aloft, and it caught the new sunlight with a brilliance beyond mere steel. It seemed to glow with its own radiance, as though the forging of star metal and dragonfire had awakened a power that transcended the shadows. Men across the field, some half-frozen, some wounded, lifted their heads. A murmur spread, a wave of realization. They had endured. The Night King was gone. Daenerys landed nearby, half-limp on Drogon, who bore numerous injuries. She gazed upon the shattered remnants of the Night King, her eyes reflecting relief and grief all at once. Tyrion, shaking with exhaustion, approached. He barely managed a nod at Arthur. Corran came, stumbling, bloodied but alive, leaning on the shoulder of a comrade. He stared at the shards of ice scattered in the snow, then at Arthur with awe. "You did it. You truly are the sword of the morning." Arthur lowered Dawn, the tip touching the snow. His entire body trembled from adrenaline and wounds. "No," he said softly. "We did it. All of us." The men around him seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The greatest threat in living memory had been vanquished, but at a terrible cost. In the aftermath, survivors wandered the battlefield, gathering the wounded, burning the dead properly so they could not rise again. Winterfell's walls, scorched and battered, still stood. The cost in human life was staggering. Yet for the first time in a long while there was hope. Over the next days, as the living recovered, a deep gratitude rose for the sword that had finished the Night King. Some whispered that it was Lightbringer reborn, others called it simply Dawn, the fabled blade of House Dayne. As for Arthur Dayne, many questions remained. Would he stay in the north, or return to Starfall? Did he plan to lay down the sword or continue to serve the Queen? The realm was at a turning point, and not all conflicts were settled by the death of the Night King. Political tensions, old grudges, and the question of royal succession still loomed. But for a brief moment, as a pale winter sun rose above the ramparts of Winterfell, Arthur stood on the battlements, Dawn strapped to his side, Corran at his elbow, gazing out over the field where the forces of death had fallen. He felt the hush of the morning wind and thought of all those who had died to make this dawn possible. He closed his eyes, remembering Rhaegar, remembering Ned Stark, remembering the child he had sworn to protect. He remembered vows spoken in a time of heartbreak and idealism. Now, at last, he had fulfilled his purpose, to stand against the night, bearing the sword that had once been forged from a fallen star. In that silent vigil, With the snow glittering and the faint warmth of the sun brushing his face, Arthur Dayne allowed himself a single moment of peace. He, the sword of the morning, had prevailed against the long night, and a new dawn shone upon Westeros.